Hi, this recording is for growers and businesses working with growers that are interested in measuring in-field food surplus and waste. The recording provides an audio companion to the guidance that WRAP published in March 2020. And separately, there's a recording that provides an overview of the reasons why a business would want to measure food waste and the benefits that it can deliver. It's worth noting that this guidance forms part of the UK's food waste reduction roadmap. It is consistent with the Quartile Commitment 2025, the Food Loss and Waste Accounting and Reporting Standard, and champions 12.3 best practice. One of the principles of the Food Waste Reduction Roadmap is that food waste should be measured in a consistent way. This means that whilst it's not obligatory to follow WRAP's guidance, the guidance is there for growers who are looking for a methodology to follow, but they can choose a different approach if they would like to. It does mean that for any business that completes measurements in accordance with this guidance, should only have to do that once, and their measurements will be equally valid for all customers. So the rest of this recording is based on a webinar given on the 19th of March 2020. We're going to rejoin that webinar now, just as we start to look at the resources available to help growers.
This is just a screenshot of what we published. You may have seen this. We published this on Tuesday. We did do a press release, and this was targeted specifically at trade press, and it was picked up by quite a lot of trade press, both the farming and waste sector trade press, which was perfect. That's exactly what we're aiming for. And what we've published, this is online. You've got the link there. So it's wrap.org.uk/roadmap-grower-guidance. And the link is appearing several places on these slides, and we will make sure that the recording of this presentation is available afterwards, so you'll be able to follow up and find the link that way too. But you can see that we've published this online, so it's free access for anyone. There's guidance for hand harvested crops, machine harvested crops, and there's also a field record sheet and reporting template. So what we're going to do is, through these next few slides, look at all of those. We're going to look at the guidance that we have for undertaking the measurements in field, both for hand harvested crops and machine harvested crops. And then we're also going to look at the template, which is an Excel document that's also available to download. I'm going to share that, and we're just going to do a dummy run so you can see what the process looks like for using that template and completing a measurement assessment and reporting. Before we actually launch into that methodology, there are a couple of definitions which are important just to frame what it is that we're looking at. So specifically, the guidance that we're looking at today is for in-field, but food waste, food surplus can arise at any stage of the supply chain. And WRAP has previously published guidance under the Food Waste Reduction Roadmap for fresh produce, and this covers those other stages, particularly the pack house and storage beyond the field. So there's guidance pre-existing out there for that. And there's equivalent guidance for other sectors as well. So there's plenty of guidance out there. What we're going to focus on specifically is in field. One of the other important definitions here is thinking about the nature of the crop. So we're specifically thinking about crops that were intended for human consumption. So that means if you're growing a fodder crop or an energy crop, or any other crop that's not intended for human consumption, it's out of scope. That doesn't mean that it's not worth measuring. If you wanted to measure, obviously, feel free to use this guidance if it's useful for you. But in terms of reporting food surplus and waste, we're specifically looking at crops that were intended for human consumption. And it's also important to note here that if you had a crop that was intended for human consumption, but then is diverted to animal feed, that is still covered. In that case, it would be food surplus. The important thing that was originally intended for human consumption. We also have a boundary of, that is only relevant to be measuring Once a crop is ready to harvest, and this is a definition that's coming from the global standard, the global definitions that we're following here in the UK. And it's important to follow this so that we're all measuring in a consistent way, so that when you're comparing different measurements, we're comparing like with like. And what this means is that for those definitions, it's only at this point that a crop becomes food in the technical sense of the definitions that have been described. Before this point, a crop is not food and it will be out of scope. It only has to be ready to harvest. It doesn't have to have actually been harvested. So if you've got a crop that's ready to harvest and you're deciding to plough it in, for example, because there's not a market for it, then because it's ready to harvest, that will be included within the definitions, it will be within scope, and it will be relevant to measure that. The last point on definitions is that it's best practice, but not a requirement, to report inedible food surplus and waste separately. So these would be things like stalks, husks, cores, pips, stones. There is actually a list, an annex included in the sector guide for fresh produce, that the guidance that already is published under the Food Waste Reduction Roadmap. We worked with industry to answer what they thought were common inedible parts and whether or not they should be included, and we've listed those in an annex. So please go to that annex if you have any questions about what is an inedible part. But just to highlight that it is best practice to record that. And I think also useful because generally the focus is on reducing waste in edible food. So that does mean if you are reporting food waste and you have an inedible component to that, it can actually be useful to report that. You will have less expectation that you'll be required to reduce it. So if you had, for example, 100 tons of food waste and 25% of that is inedible, then just from a public perception perspective, there will be less of a focus on that and less of a requirement for you to be tackling it. On the left-hand side, I've also included the food surplus and waste destinations. So these are important. These are what we're saying is if you have a crop that was intended for human consumption, it's reached the point where it's ready for harvest. Instead of it going into the food supply chain, it has ended up in one of these destinations. That is what we're focusing on. In addition to the destinations that are listed there, for food surplus redistribution, so that's donating food to charitable purposes or also commercial redistribution, that would also be considered food surplus. Okay, so moving on, we're now going to look into the detail of how to undertake measurements in the field. What I'm going to do is talk through a few different aspects of this. Firstly, using existing data, if a business is lucky enough to have that. Then looking at, if you don't have existing data, how you would be undertaking these measurements, specifically for hand harvested crops and separately for machine harvested crops. Look at how you take those measurements in the field, and also how to account for whole areas that are left unharvested. So fields blocks that are deliberately not harvested, and also smaller areas that are left unharvested, maybe deliberately or maybe by mistake. So the first area to look at is using existing data. If you have pre-existing data, this is likely to be your most reliable data, and I'd absolutely encourage a business to use this. And it probably means that they don't need to be capturing any extra data. So an example that I've come across where this would be the case is quite common in fruit and certainly in berries, that you would harvest 100% of the crop, whether it's going to market or whether it's going to be destroyed. And growers do that because there's pest pressure from fruit flies, Spotted Wing Drosophila. And so they would capture all of the crop they'll put it into containers and destroy it. So that means that if you had easy access to the data that they might have on destroying that crop, or if you could maybe set up an easy system of measuring, for example, how many buckets or mini skips are collected at the end of the day, and you know the volume of that mini skip or that bucket, then that's going to be your best way of capturing data, and you should use that. I would recommend that if you have pre-existing data, you do look at the guidance and look at the reporting template just to check that the existing data that you have provides all of the necessary information. It may be that there are one or two additional bits of information you need to gather about the crop, so just consider whether or not that is the case and add that to your data capture. But if you have existing data, that's your best resource. Absolutely use that, and there's no need to be undertaking additional measurements. Unfortunately, for a lot of people, they're not going to be in such a fortunate position, and you are going to have to undertake sample measurements. This is what we recommend rather than measuring 100% of the crop, which is clearly going to be normally extremely challenging. The methodology is based on setting up sampling areas, taking measurements within those sampling areas, and using those sample measurements to extrapolate out your entire crop. So it is an estimate, and clearly there's going to be some uncertainty around that, but it seems like the best compromise between being a practical, achievable methodology and getting data which is still of a level enough that's reliable. Setting up the sampling areas and replication of the sampling areas is the best approach to getting reliable data. And one of the key things that we're recommending here is that with any field or block that you're measuring, you should measure in at least 3 sampling areas. And that is the most important thing to do to get reliable data. And if you're unable to do that, if you're only able to measure, for example, in one area, I would be extremely cautious about the quality of that data. From speaking to other researchers in this area, I do know that 3 sampling areas, provided the sampling area is big enough, that is considered to be a good way of getting statistically reliable data. I'd say that perhaps we may not get statistically reliable data from growers. We may well do, but it's certainly going to be good reliable data, even if it's not statistically of high quality. But if you only have 1 sampling area, perhaps even 2, it's going to be of low quality, and it would be, you should consider that with a caution, and perhaps even consider it may not be worth undertaking those measurements if you cannot do it, if you cannot replicate across 3 sampling areas. So there are also recommendations on the size of the sampling areas. This is from conversation with industry and researchers to work out what is the most achievable practical sampling area, but then which is also achieving a size which is going to deliver reliable data. And there are different areas depending on the nature of the crops. So what we're specifying here is for row crops, we're looking at hand harvested row crops. We would say at least 1 row wide and 10 meters long. For other hand harvested crops, each sampling area should be at least 50 meters squared, and obviously you can cut that whichever way you'd like, but as example it would be 10 meters by 5 meters. On the next slide we'll look at the equivalent for machine harvested crops. One really important mention is health and safety. I appreciate that that's something that everyone is considering, but it's particularly relevant on farms and certainly relevant in this case. I do know that from other colleagues and researchers that have been in the field undertaking these measurements, it's really important to be undertaking the measurements as soon as possible after harvest, because you will get crop degrading, or you'll get animals or birds coming into the field and eating it, and obviously your measurements then won't get won't be reliable if you're missing that. So if you're in the field soon after harvest, there may be machinery, other operations going on. Health and safety is really important. Even more important for machine harvested crops. So please do bear that in mind and take appropriate action. The process for machine harvested crops is very similar to what we've just looked at. So again, we're looking at least 3 sampling areas. And the difference, the important difference here, is that we're looking at one complete bed and a furrow wheeling, furrow or wheeling for the width of the sampling area. And that sampling area should be at least 3 meters long. Okay, so you set up your sampling areas. Now envisage, if you can, how you're actually going to measure what's in that area. The first thing is to work out whether or not the crop is within scope. So we're thinking particularly here about whether the crop that's left in that area was damaged before it became ready to harvest or after. And that can be quite a challenging thing to work out. What seems to be a practical way of understanding that, and the approach that I would recommend, is to exclude any crop that is completely undersized, it's malformed or rotten. Those seem to be a practical way of saying, right, that crop was damaged before it was ready to harvest, therefore it was damaged before it became food, it's outside of the scope of the definitions and wouldn't be included. So gather all of that up as a first step and just exclude it. Set it to one side. You don't need to do anything more with that for the purposes of food surplus and waste reporting. Now you've got everything that's remaining within that sampling area is food surplus and waste. So you want to gather all of that up, and I'd recommend weighing it if you can in the field, or putting it into a container or a sack to take it off of the field and weigh it back in the office or in the barn, wherever there are scales. I'd also say for a root crop or tubers, it is really important to dig through the sampling area as well, and that's one of the reasons why you've got a smaller sampling area for machine harvested crops where we're typically seeing these crops, because it's got to be manageable if you're digging through the area. But there is a lot of crop that tends to be left below the soil surface. So if you're only measuring what you can see visually from the soil surface, it's very likely to be an underestimate. Once you've gathered that up, you've weighed it, if you can identify a cause of the waste. It's not essential, but that's a really valuable bit of information, particularly if a grower is going to be thinking about, well, what can we do with this? What can we do differently next season? Or if you're participating in a whole chain food waste reduction exercise, that can provide a grower with really useful information to be able to talk in a neutral way with their colleagues along the supply chain of saying, you know, this crop is out of specification for XYZ reason. We know that for X reason, we're seeing however many tons of crop wasted. It seems to be a real opportunity to improve productivity and tackle food waste. Is there something we could challenge around the specification? So it can really help to have useful, neutral conversations with colleagues in the supply chain. And the last recommendation here is that you take a photograph as well, because it's much easier to explain this back in the office or with colleagues if you've got a photo. It just helps to answer questions that you haven't thought of at the time, or just the fact that a picture speaks a thousand words. Okay, so that is actually the field measurements completed. The other important thing to consider is for whole areas, blocks, fields, or sub-areas that are left unharvested. So, you know, this might be because you don't have a harvest team, or, which is particularly relevant this year and last year, or it might be that you don't have a market. So for whatever reason, you decided not to harvest this crop. or there might be areas that have been missed by mistake, which can certainly happen. And here you've got two options. It is absolutely legitimate to just make an estimate of the food surplus and waste based on your typical yield from on an area basis multiplied by the area of the crop that's not harvested. So as long as you know your average yield and the area that's left unharvested, you can just multiply those two and generate an estimate. That seems an entirely reasonable way of approaching this. One thing to bear in mind is one of the reasons why a grower may not be harvesting that crop is that it may be underweight. So it's not coming up to specification. And in that case, there's an obvious reason for thinking of going into the field and measuring it in exactly the same way as we've just described. And why a grower may want to do that is because obviously their food surplus and waste, in this instance, where the crop is underweight, will actually be lower, potentially significantly lower, than if you're just using an average yield for that crop. So an important reason for managing message management and getting accurate information to inform decisions. If that's the case, you may choose to go into the field and actually take measurements in the same way as we've looked at. Okay, that's the methodology. It's not too complex. What I'm going to look at next is this Excel file, the field record sheet that we have. I'm then going to just talk through a couple more slides on what you can do with your data to make the most of it, and then we're going to open it up to Q&As. So I've mentioned the field record sheet and reporting template a couple of times. What it is an Excel file that's downloadable from our website under the Food Waste Reduction Roadmap pages, following that link that is on screen, was on screen before and will be on screen later on. The Excel can be printed, so it's been set up with the print areas and the design to be able to be printed. It's got a few prompts for the user to take into the field, reminders of that methodology, the approach that you've got to follow in the field. And then it's got blank cells for the grower to record the key information about the crop and the measurements that they're undertaking. What's the attraction perhaps of using the Excel beyond that is there are then a few calculations in the background that will convert those measurements into a food surplus and waste report. And this report is in exactly the same format as we use under the roadmap, and all businesses, including customer businesses that have signed up to the roadmap, have agreed that they will just use this single reporting template, so the burden on businesses measuring and reporting is minimized. So that means that if you measure and complete a report for one customer using this template, it's equally valid for any other customers. So when we use this Excel, as well as providing useful prompts for recording measurements in the field, once you've completed that field record sheet, there are calculations in the background which will automatically populate a food surplus and waste report, which is compliant with those food waste reduction roadmap reporting requirements, and it can just be sent on to your customer, can shared with colleagues in exactly the way that any other report can be. So at this stage, I'm going to stop sharing these slides and just switch to the Excel itself. And we're just going to look through a dummy run. I'm going to imagine that RAP has changed tack. We're venturing out into a new area, and we're going to actually become growers, which I would love. I'd be right up for that. So we're not going to look at the detail of this right now, but there is this simple instructions page here for users to look at as well. Obviously, a user can use this hand in hand with the guidance document, which gives step-by-step methodology, much as we just talked through. So I would recommend that users look at both the guidance and this Excel template. Then in the field record sheet, we're just going to look through here and do a dummy run of what it's like to complete this. So you can see in these red boxes, I've just picked out a few of the key instructions from the guidance, and this is just a reminder of how the Excel can be used. So let's carry on this example and pretend that wrap is now a grower. So I'm going to be the person completing this report, and because I've done a few projects working with strawberry growers, I've got a bit of familiarity there. It's certainly not great familiarity, but hopefully this will make it a more reliable example. So we're going to look at strawberries and just pick a standard variety, Alsanta, and we're growing locally to where we're based here in Banbury. And obviously this is a strawberry crop, so it's a multi-year crop, but we're going to complete this date into the date for when the cropping season began, so the beginning of the season here. And the first crop I'm going to look at is an early season crop that we've got growing under glass, in a polytunnel. And it completed cropping, I'm hoping this is reasonably accurate, in June for that first flush, and that's the crop that I have measured. So my measurements on an area basis, I'm cropping in hectares, so I'm going to select that. And we're only small, we're just starting out strawberry production, we're growing across 3 hectares, and our average yield per hectare is 20 tonnes. So I'm going to put in here 60 tonnes for my total yield. And all of this basic information here is just necessary to help us complete the field record sheet, and also to help convert the sample measurements into a food surplus and waste estimate for my entire crop. So that's the only reason why we're putting this in. A grower, a user, does not necessarily have to send this information anywhere. They can just use it for themselves. But if they wanted to be sharing it and they're comfortable with sharing it with their customer, then obviously they should be looking at putting this detail in on that basis and just checking that they're comfortable with that. So the next prompt that we've got here is to go into the field and set up our sampling areas. So we've got a reminder to do this immediately after we've completed harvesting. We're going to go in and measure out the sampling areas. And in this case, we'll look at strawberries, so it's a hand harvested row crop. So we're going to be looking at 1 row wide and 10 meters long. And then we've got the guidance for setting up the area of a sample for other crops there as well. So in this case, it's in a polytunnel and I'm going to be ground production. So I'm looking at a sampling area that's 10 meters long, but I'm going to set only ½ meter wide. And I'm following the best practice. I'm setting up 3 sampling areas and doing that for each of those. Equal sampling, sample sizes for each sampling area. So there we go. And then we've got the instructions here to actually go through the crop, exclude everything that's out of scope, and then the instructions on how to actually include the crop and undertake our measurements. So I've followed those instructions. I now have an assessment of how much crop is left in after we've completed cropping. And in my hypothetical example, I'm going to say these are the waste rates that I've got in each of my sampling areas, and mostly it's because the crop wasn't ripe, but actually in one of these areas I'm going to say that it was because I didn't have a buyer. The market just wasn't there, so I'm not going to bother expending cost on labour going through it. So here is the optional field to include inedible parts, and you can see on this field and a number of the fields we've got a little bit of information pops up to help the user understand what is meant, and in this case by inedible parts. I'm actually going to say that for strawberries there's only negligible inedible parts. That would be the stalk. So I'm going to say it's actually only 5% of the weight is, oops, sorry. Oh, sorry, clicked on the wrong thing there. Hopefully you can still see on screen the Excel. So I'm just going to click on that. Yes, I've actually taken some measurements of what the stalks are. I know that it's only a small amount. So I'm just going to include that detail here, so that's included in my measurements. There's also a small area of the crop where later on in the season I've just decided that I'm just going to leave the crop on the field, on the plant, because I didn't have a market and it's the end of the season, so I'm not too worried about infecting any other crops. So I'm not worried about fruit fly, and I'm just going to leave it there. So I'm going to include that here too as well, just for the purposes of this example, so you can see how that works. And in this case, 100% of my crop, no, sorry, actually 90% of my crop is going to anaerobic digestion of the crop waste, and 10% is just being left on the crop and then ending up in the field. So what I'm going to do is include that 10% here as the destination. There's also an option here to include the moisture content. This is optional, you don't have to do it. In this case, I'm going to say include it. This can be useful if, particularly if you're looking at mass balance assessments. So that may occur if you're looking at a whole chain project. So for example, if you were then supplying this crop to a marketing company who are doing a mass balance approach to measure their food surplus and waste, just weighing the crop as it comes in and weighing the crop as it goes out. There may be moisture loss in the meantime. Moisture loss is not food waste, so it's just useful to factor that into the calculation. So I'm going to record that here so that my partners in the supply chain can account for that. So that's it. I've completed the data entry. And now, hopefully, what we can see is that it's converted that into a report. So I haven't had to enter any additional information. All of this has been picked up automatically from my data entry there. This food surplus, this reporting template is the template that's compliant. It's exactly the same as the template that's already available under the Food Waste Reduction Roadmap. It's just got this additional front-end stuff for the field record sheet. And you can see that it's picked up all of the information. From my sample measurements, it's giving me, it's extrapolating that out to an entire cropping area, so my entire 3 hectares. And it's saying that overall I've got 4.6 tonnes of food surplus and waste. In this case, it's all food waste. And it's that equates to just over 7% of my production. And I know that of that 4.6 tonnes, 5% of that is inedible. And we can also see that information is being translated to the destinations as well. So it's picking up for the tonnage going to AD and the tonnage which is left in the field. So that would be really useful if your supply chain partners are working with multiple growers, for example, and grossing this up for their own reporting requirements, or for an individual business if they wanted to complete this assessment for their own reasons. They've now got a report that they can publish, which is entirely compliant with all of the global and UK requirements. The other aspect of this Excel, which I just want to quickly talk through, is that the original concept was that you could just go into one field and make 3 sample measurements and extrapolate that out to your entire production area to give you an overall estimate of your food surplus and waste. Some growers that were involving in the development of the guidance were saying, well, actually, we've got a really large production area, and some of that production area is quite different, so we don't want to rely on estimates from just one field. So is there an option to record measurements from multiple fields, undertake those measurements in those different fields, and then through this Excel, gross that up into a single food surplus and waste report. So that's something else that we've also factored in here. So I'm going to carry that on in my strawberry example. What you do have to do to make the Excel work is, let's say that I've got 3 sampling areas. So I'm just going to convert this to the default option here, which is to say that, so this is an instruction screen for taking measurements across multiple fields. At the bottom of this, and there is a reminder, it's very clear on the original instructions tab, that if you're going to take measurements of multiple fields, you must go to this tab here that we're looking at and complete this step that I'm going to go through now. What you need to say is, for my example, I'm going to look at measurements across 3 fields. And what I've got to do is say how those 3 fields translate in terms of the proportion of my entire cropping area. So what I mean by that is, so for this example, that first assessment we just undertook was looking at a strawberry crop grown in a polytunnel at the beginning of the season, but it was ground production. I'm going to say that that was just 25% of my production. Here you can see, because I've only put 25%, this has thrown up an error because these must add up to 100% for the multiplications to work. I want to look at 3 different crops. So as well as growing in a polytunnel ground, I've also got the majority of my crop is in a polytunnel, but on tabletop. And then also I switch back to my ground production system at the end of the season, just this hypothetical, and to have a second crop from my ground production at the end of the season. After that first flush, the crop has another flush, and I go in and harvest that as well. So I'm just going to demonstrate what it would look like to complete those measurements for those multiple crops. So it's very quick to do. So you can see that it has pulled through some of the basic data from that first data entry that we undertook. You just need to specify here whether or not the field is in a different place. Actually, our production is all on the same site. So we're all here in Banbury, in Oxfordshire. So let's say, again, this was the beginning of the season was slightly later here. So let's say this was then coming on the beginning of May. And I undertook my measurements immediately after we stopped harvesting, and I'm going to say that that was towards the end of June. So all I need to do now is complete exactly the same data entry about the sampling areas and the measurements as before. My tabletop is actually narrower, so I'm just going to put a smaller width, but I'm still following the guidance with 10 meters long. And in this case, I'm had lower waste rates. So let's just say that's what my waste rates was there. I would want to follow best practice and include the causes there, but I'm not going to do that right now, just not to take up too much of your time. And I would do the same for my other crop. This is the ground production in a polytunnel coming in at the end of the season. So we're going to look at still the same area. And the beginning of the season for this was actually later on. So let's say this was just starting at the beginning of September, and it cropped through to, let's say, the first week of October. So it's all exactly the same. So I'm back onto ground production here. So I've got my width of the sampling area as they were before, slightly higher waste. The crop's getting a bit more marginal now. So I'm going to have, that's my waste rates that I've measured in the field for this third crop. So now when I go back to the field record sheet, there are calculations, the reporting template, the calculations in the background have pulled through the data from those different samples, and you can see that my overall tonnage and waste percentage is different to what it was before, and it's pulled that through to the destinations as well. Great. I hope you've got a good understanding of how that Excel works. Hopefully that looks like a useful resource for growers to take into the field. I'm just going to finish off with whilst I'm just sharing my screen, I'm just going to also show you, if I can see it online, what the guidance looks like. So this is just going onto our website, and if the internet works, so you can see the guidance here. I just wanted to show you that it's very short. Is the most important thing. So we have an overview screen setting out some of the context and the process. We have a bit of the important detail around definitions, very similar to what we just talked through. And then we've got all of these steps here about undertaking your planning and measuring, just as we've talked through. It's all on this one sheet here. So keep it nice and simple and hopefully user-friendly. And then there's an extra slide here, so an extra page in the guidance on making the most of your data. So that's what we're going to just quickly look at now. Returning back to the slides. Okay. Great. So just to finish off before we open it up to questions, I just want to talk through a couple of options that you might like to consider as well for your own business or for businesses that you're working with. One of the drawbacks of setting up multiple sampling areas is that that's clearly labor intensive. There's going to be a cost associated with that, and that's going to be a barrier to a number of growers, which is a real shame. It is recommended because that's the way to generate reliable data. And if you have unreliable data, it's difficult to see the value of undertaking any measurements. So that is a shame, but it seems like that's the best way of recommending growers take this forward if they would like to. One thing that I would like to really stress is our guidance is not obligatory. The intention of creating this guidance came from requests that I was receiving where businesses were coming to us and saying, we would like to be measuring food waste in field, but we don't know how. Or we would like to do it, but we want to make sure that the methodology is consistent across time. We don't want someone coming to us and saying, well, you should do it a different way for one customer or another customer, or that it changes year to year. So for those key, important bits of feedback, that was our motivation for developing this guidance and our motivation for trying to provide clarity around the approach. But it's not obligatory. And I would like to stress that, and I think it also puts the onus on the rest of the supply chain to be thinking on how they can support growers where appropriate. I mean, some growers are big businesses, and there they may be well able to shoulder this themselves, or very motivated to be doing this themselves. I imagine that motivation will be there for a lot of smaller growers too, but not for everyone. So I think for the supply chain, we should also be thinking about, well, what can we be doing to support growers to undertake these measurements? Do we need to be providing a technical colleague to go into the field and undertake these measurements, or to support the grower to take these measurements? And it's also something I'm very willing to do from WRAP, is to provide webinars like this to other growers if that would be useful. So please do ask if that would be helpful. One of the options that can be considered, we've mentioned the idea of, well, if you've already got data, then use that rather than doing additional measurements. The other option is to think about whether it's appropriate to just count the waste rather than to weigh it. And this could be appropriate if you've already undertaken measurements to understand what the weight of a typical waste product is in the field. So let's say for apples or parsnips, whatever it is, if I go into the field and after harvest and I've got my wasted crop in the field and I measured 20 items, generated an average of that, is it now an option for me to just count the number of parsnips or the number of apples rather than having to weigh it? That's an option that I would definitely recommend people consider. I would recommend weighing this, specifically the wasted crop, to generate your average rather than an average apple or whatever the crop is. Because if you take the weight from, for example, an average in storage, then that could be different to the average of the crop in the field, because specifically you are excluding the crop that's left in the field. And then I'd also encourage users to think about ways of making the most of their data. So if you're going to the effort of generating this, what more value can you get from it? So one of the nice options that I've seen businesses and other researchers do is to think about other ways, useful ways of categorizing the waste, and categorizing it as either marketable, edible but out of specification, or not edible, is one really simple and attractive categorization. It's not essential, it's certainly not required for food surplus and waste reporting, but a user that's looking to analyze this data and thinking, oh, well, wow, I've got, of my waste, 50% of that was marketable, it was edible and was within specification. That prompts quite a few questions, and that may suggest opportunity. Likewise, if you're participating, looking at measurement, and you've got a new pest coming along into your sector, and you're worried about the waste incidence rates as a result of that pest, then think about measuring and capturing data specifically around damage caused by that pest. And I'm sure that growers can think of other useful ways of adding to this and making the data more useful for them. I'd also really encourage growers or the supply chain to think about how this data can be generated within groups. So it's not just an individual grower undertaking measurements on their own. It's as part of a group, so that growers are measuring the same thing at the same time, and then you're getting that comparative data at the end. Clearly there's sensitivities there, and you'd only want to do that where a group has got that level of trust where they're comfortable to do that. And also you may want to think about how the data is presented to make sure those sensitivities are addressed. It's also a useful role here that the supply chain could provide, or that other third parties can provide in supporting those growers. So is there a role to facilitate that group? Is there a role to analyse the data at the end of the season to be generating that comparative data? But we have certainly seen through all of our projects that it's the comparisons that generate most value. When you see the growers looking at one grower achieving significantly more yield in comparable systems to another grower, it just throws up lots of questions and lots of opportunities to improve. And finally, just a reminder to say there is other guidance that I've mentioned, the sector guidance for fresh produce. The guidance we've looked at specifically addresses food surplus and waste in the field, but there is fresh produce sector guidance for food waste beyond the field for the pack house, for storage, other operations, available to download from the Food Waste Reduction Roadmap web pages. There's also this resource we've developed, the Food Surplus Network. So recognising that for growers it can be a challenge to identify alternative markets for their produce, but also realising that there's now a huge number of alternative markets, whether that's eBay-like platforms are actually quite developed, thinking about the logistics and the credit aspects of those trades, whether it's businesses looking to generate insect protein from food waste, manufacturers looking specifically for out-of-spec produce to generate wonky crisps, wonky juices, these sorts of products. All of those simple details are available on this website, so it's just a nice portal where a grower can go to one place, look at all of these options and get really simple information about those businesses, including contact details so that they can follow up with them if they'd like to. My email address is there too, and if anyone's got any questions that they'd like to follow up with me in person about this guidance after the webinar, then please do. I'd love to support businesses to take up this guidance more. That completes the information that I wanted to talk through with you. I appreciate that I've been talking for quite a long time and you guys may have some questions. So I'd love to stop now and dedicate time to looking at that. Maria, just to ask you in the first place, have there been questions coming through on the chat as we've been running along?
Yes, there has been a few questions and a point raised as well.
Great. Okay, let's keep everyone muted then for the time being, and we'll prioritise those questions and see how we go.
Okay, great. The first one that came in was regarding the scope. So this attendee gets the point of how the scope was set. However, because of the high impact of animal feed, their question is, should we not extend the scope because it has an impact on the human food chain eventually?
Yes, so to an extent animal feed is covered in the sense that any produce that is out of that was destined for the human food supply chain but that goes to animal feed instead, that would be a food surplus destination and should be captured. And this guidance would be just as applicable to that as any other. I suspect the question is more saying, well, look, there's lots of crops that are specifically going to animal feed rather than intended to go into human consumption. So why aren't we capturing that data on that too? And specifically, that just doesn't fall within the definitions. We do need to try and make our job manageable to the extent we can. And so we are following those definitions and prioritising what fits within the definitions and within the scope in the first place. It doesn't mean that this guidance could not be extended. If anyone wanted to be measuring waste specifically in fodder crops, they would be just as able to use this guidance and follow the measurement approach. I would request that that's not reported as food surplus and waste. If it's reported as specifically as waste of a fodder crop, that would be really interesting to see. But it's just a case of having to prioritise our work and specifically focusing on food surplus and waste for the time being.
Okay. It's interesting you talk about definitions, because the point raised was about using the term controlled combustion. So this attendee said that they know that the FSW destinations use this, but they believe it's confusing and inaccurate. Producers are unlikely to see that term and think it means incineration with energy recovery, and they believe that that needs to be addressed. Do you have anything to respond?
So to say on the Excel spreadsheet, there are prompts on that. So if you were looking at the Excel and you're completing that, when you click on one of the cells equivalent to controlled combustion, or I think the alternative destination for uncontrolled, basically just a bonfire or something like that, that would be for the other destinations. There's information in those cells that pops up to provide that definition. So hopefully there would be an opportunity to try and reduce the level of confusion there. Unfortunately, it is a definition which is set under the Food Loss and Waste Global Standard, and that's certainly something that I can feed back to WRI, the World Resources Institute, that sort of manage the standard, and see if we could provide any additional clarity around that. It is something that's reflected in our guidance as well, but I do appreciate that some of the terminology is not necessarily instinctive. Thank you for the point. We've followed up.
Another question. Is the food waste calculator on the CFT covering the same data set, or are we better advising growers to complete this offline Excel version? Maybe just clarify this.
Sure. Yes, so the CFT is the Cool Farm tool, which many of you may have come across or use. I worked with the Cool Farm tool to develop a data input for them so that food surplus and waste could be captured within the Cool Farm tool in addition. So the Cool Farm tool originally looked at greenhouse gases. It's got modules for reporting information on water and biodiversity as well, and it now is enabled to allow users, particularly farmers, to report on their food surplus and waste as well. The Cool Farm tool is different to this methodology and the guidance that we've just talked through this morning, in that WRAP's guidance that we've just published explains how to undertake the measurements and the methodology and the process that you should follow to do that. The Cool Farm tool doesn't provide that. It doesn't explain how to measure. What the Cool Farm tool offers is a mechanism that once you have your data, you can report it into the Cool Farm tool, so it becomes sort of a data storage for a user. A user can access their records year to year and over time if they'd like to. There's also an option for them to share that data with other users of the Cool Farm tool. Apparently that function is not fully enabled at the moment for this aspect of the Cool Farm tool, so it does mean that that's only possible if the user provided their login details to a third party, so that they could access their records to be able to see their food surplus and waste report. So there is that functionality there, although a little bit clunky. So that is how the two are different. If a user generated their data using WRAP's guidance and then wanted to input that into the Cool Farm tool, both of our systems are compatible. We're both compliant with the roadmap and Champions 12.3 and the global standard. So both should work together if a user would like to follow that approach instead.
Okay. When completing the tool, what if producers grow multiple crops? So there the strawberries carried across to the other tab.
Yes. And here I imagine multiple crops as in different types of crops. So it might be strawberries and it might be plums, for example. And I would recommend using an Excel for each crop. So if you're looking at a completely different crop, you know, in that example, strawberries and plums, I would just generate an Excel specifically for one crop for the strawberries and another Excel for a different one. Obviously, if you wanted to report that combined, it would just mean looking at that reporting template tab and just adding those results together, which should be fairly straightforward.
Okay. Are there any produce categories that RAP would like field food waste review to be prioritised first?
Oh, thank you for the question.
That's a good one.
So generally there is a lack of data around food waste and primary production. It's certainly not a requirement for users that complete this to share their data with RAP. If they're able to, we would absolutely love it because evidence is so powerful. It is what has enabled us to be able to support industry to provide resources like this, to take forward Quartile, to take forward the roadmap. It's only with the power of that evidence that we've been able to do that. So if anyone's able to share willing, it would be great. Some of the key crops are potatoes, apples, carrots, tomatoes, because that also has a high resource impact. Bananas also would be a great one. So this is not just look at UK crops. You know, bananas as another high volume crop. Would love to have some data on that. But I also think this is new for growers, and I'm not expecting growers to suddenly open their doors and go, great, this is what I've been waiting for. I really want to do this. Some of them will want to do that. Some of them do want to act. And I think there's also a sense of saying, well, which growers, which of my sectors do I know are going to be more responsive to this or more engaged? So please think about that. And maybe the opportunity is just go with those growers that you know are receptive, forward-looking, want to do work on food surplus and waste, regardless of the sector that they're in. Another thought that's just crossed my mind mushrooms would be great as well. Thank you for the question.
Great. So just one final one to end, please. Will you be sending out this presentation, and when will the recording be available?
Yes, we'll certainly send out the slides to people who've joined. I'm not sure whether everyone has accepted the invitation. So we'll just have to work out the best way of identifying you all to make sure that you get it. Working processes for everyone are a little bit strange at the moment, so please bear with us. It might take us a few more days to get that out, but we will do that, and certainly next week we'll send that. So if you don't receive it, please do get in touch and ask if you know, and we'll send it out to you. We'll do that for both the slides and also the recording. I'm also very willing to, as I mentioned before, provide a similar training webinar for growers. If for people who are unable to join this, very happy to do that. So if any of you are thinking of working with other growers in your group or other suppliers, please get in touch with me. I'd be happy to consider options for providing a webinar directly to them. And the value of that would be they could ask their questions and get answers specific to their queries and interests as well.
Great.
Thanks, Maria. Has that addressed all the questions on the chat?
Yes, that has. Thank
Great.
you. There are no questions or hands raised.
Okay, we'll just give it a little pause, just in case anyone has any further questions. Feel free to raise your hand or use chat to ask additional questions. We'll just wait for a moment. Great. In which case, folks, thank you ever so much. It's been really nice to engage with you. Thank you very much for showing an interest in this. I hope the webinar has been useful. please get in touch if you have any questions. And I hope you have a very nice rest of your day. Thank you and goodbye.